So, Sharon.
So appropriation, transformation, copy, simulation, parody, interpretation, theft, incorporation, transfer, substitution, deconstruction, plagiarism, irony, repetition, hybridity, collage, simulation, montage, staging. Memories of events are the raw material of history that is stored in the various apparatuses of museums, libraries, collections, archives, and discourses. They in turn give rise to the assembly of practices related to both storage and interpretation that form the basis of how various documents become appropriated. How things are appropriated becomes the fabric of how they become imagined.
It's the British Museum. It's the 18th century.
The British Museum is a monument to the appropriation of Greek classical culture. Its facade simulates a classical temple whose lineage is that of the ancient world and not that of an emerging modernity. The collection assembles artifacts from the entire history of culture, as though it is possible to portray such a narrative. In the main, it reflects the power of British imperial history, which is now displayed under the monolithic and benign term world culture.
These are the Elgin marbles. They don't call them the Elgin marbles any longer. They call them Parthenon sculptures, but they were always known as the Elgin marbles.
The Elgin marbles form the most prestigious and controversial part of the collection. They were acquired in a period of Turkish occupation of Greece, and although purchased, the overall circumstances were highly suspect. The Greek nation have consistently asked for the return of these artifacts through both legal and ethical challenges. The British case asserts that the history of their ownership is now part of the identity, not just of the museum, but of the formation of modern British culture. A French replica of Angkor Wat during the 1931 Exposition Coloniale de Paris.
Angkor Wat was almost the French imagined that they'd discovered it in the 19th century. And it became a great reference point for French colonial culture. And here they simulated the ruin.
So why didn't that survive like the Eiffel Tower did?
Hmm?
Why
It,
didn't that survive?
it was just for an event, an exposition. So it wasn't permanent. The Eiffel Tower was an exception. It was going to be taken apart, but it was so popular they decided to keep it.
Because it looks like quite a substantial building they built.
Hmm.
The Elgin marbles form the most prestigious.
No, that's
Yep. Michael Foucault believed that historical narratives tended towards an image of history that consisted of smooth continuities, as opposed to irregular structures prone to exhibiting ruptures or breaks. History of thought, of knowledge, of philosophy, of literature seems to be seeking and discovering more and more discontinuities, whereas history appears to be abandoning the eruption of events in favor of stable structures.
from David Lean's early 60s version of Lawrence of Arabia, starring Peter O'Toole. I mean, most people retain an image of Lawrence from the film. I mean, in life, he was just over 5 feet tall, 5 feet 2 and 5 feet 4.
The film by David Lean, Lawrence of Arabia, in 1962 became the prevailing image of the original persona of Lawrence. History then appears like this, a mixture of fiction and fact that is open to the process of reappropriation, like a collage of the symbolic, imaginary, and real. Historical collections represent the various lineages and mediums of the culture of the past. Each in their way serve to demark periods, styles, movements, and passages. Increasingly, curators of these assemblages are seeking ways to make these collections responsive to the present, and as a way of exploring this demand, exhibitions are offered to display the connection between the art of the past and the contemporary art. In this installation, two paintings by Flora Yukanovic are placed in the frames of two Francois Boucher paintings and hung in the same place, whereas the Boucher paintings are hung without frames in a separate place. With this, the codes of presentation are reversed and thus identity is questioned.
This is a new exhibition at the Wallace Collection. So there's the contemporary painting in place of a real Boucher. So it's a real frame of a Boucher, but they've swapped the frame. The real Boucher is in a small, like it's shown like a contemporary painting without a frame in a separate space, whereas this contemporary painting is shown where the historical Boucher once was.
So how did it make the original appear?
I mean, it's strange. It sort of distances the painting from its facade or its context, which is highly ornate with objects and other paintings. So it's got a context which looks like it's a Rococo context. So it strips it of its context.
It becomes quite disenfranchised.
Yeah, it's almost like it loses the history.
For me, the candlesticks, clocks, porcelain, wallpapers, and fabrics are just as exciting as the paintings, and each time I go back, I spot something new that inspires me. I usually visit before I begin a painting to restock my brain with Rococo imagery. Right now, I'm working on a painting inspired by the dress in Fragonard's The Musical Contest in 1755, which somehow feels simultaneously like a piece of ripe fruit, a bloody heart, or some other organ of the folds, or the folds of petals in a flower bud.
I mean, it's very strange that, I mean, the Rococo is one of the most despised periods in European art, especially in relationship to modernity. It's seen as aberrant. So the appropriation of it right now is a kind of very transgressive move, but one which is proving very popular. I think their paintings have fetched up to £2 million recently. This is a recent exhibition at the National Gallery where they showed Piero della Francesca's painting in the collection with two Hockney paintings. And Hockney chose the blue. So this is one of the most distinguished paintings in the collection. Almost perfect geometry. You can see the circle where the dove is at the center.
Hockney's two paintings are both about a relationship to the reproduction of art in the form of a postcard, a poster, or a book. This then lays the stress on the painting as an image, as opposed to the inner schematic process. Yuan Yuglo cites having a close relationship with this painting, but it is the inner geometry that attracted his attention rather than the completed image. Cecily Brown, Unmoored from Her Reflection, 2021.
It's in the Courtauld collection. And it draws upon, as much as a painter like de Kooning, it draws upon Baroque painting in the collection.
The idea of the contemporary passage is based on the anxiety related to modernist progression, so invariably restages a sense of tradition outside of modernity. History in this context is often viewed as inert or suspended. Rather than the seeking out of a new stance within the process of appropriation, tradition itself begins to be viewed as a fertile terrain for aesthetic exploration. Picasso's painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon in 1907 was termed as Picasso's African painting because of the influence of African masks on two of the five female figures.
This is Velázquez. It's in the Prado de Meninas, which is an enormous painting. It's really worth visiting the Prado to see it. Or to be in the Velázquez room. It's quite phenomenal, stunning painting.
In 1957, Picasso started to produce an extended series of variations on Las Niñas, 1656. It was started 20 years after Guernica and was in part painted as a statement about the way Republicans were still imprisoned 18 years after the end of the Civil War. Is he working at similar scale for those, or are they more study size?
Smaller. The original painting is really very, very substantial.
Picasso was always preoccupied by his relationship to great paintings of the past, and he would devote whole periods to the re-inscription or reimagining of these works. If someone want to copy Las Meninas entirely in good faith, for example, upon reaching a certain point, and if that one was me, I would say, what if you put them a little more to the right or left? I'll try to do it my way, forgetting about Velasquez. The test would surely bring me to modify or change the light because of having changed the position of a character. So, little by little, that would be a detestable Meninas for a traditional painter, but would be my Meninas.
His painting was thought to be both Titian and is all from the studio he was learning in.
The history of painting is in part a process of reinscribing the memory of other paintings in ways that form a signifying chain. It is as if history itself is turned into a process of becoming, with moments of restaging or rearticulation.
His Manet.
Manet's painting serves as a bridge between appropriation of a Renaissance painting by Titian and its own process of appropriation later within modernist art. This process results in the painting becoming an icon or a model of a new passage by which the aesthetic image is viewed.
There is Picasso's version of Luncheon in the Grass, 1960.
In the 1950s, William Burroughs experimented with the use of cut-up technique, which had been a feature of the Dada movement. The technique destroys logical continuity within the narrative, but in breaking open the text, unexpected conjunctions arise.
This is Francis Bacon's version of Pope Innocent X.
Francis Bacon wanted to make a version of Pope Innocent X, 1650, based upon Velázquez's original painting. As part of this process of appropriation, he also incorporated the screaming head of the nurse from the Battleship of Potemkin, 1926. Bacon produced 50 variants of this painting in the 50s and the early 60s. Sketches of Spain, 1960, was a studio recording based on a fusion of classical jazz and flamenco music. This became known as a third stream of music, at a later date, world music. It is widely regarded as one of the greatest recordings of this hybrid genre. Like the principle of montage in cinema, Miles Davis introduced similar process of editing together various elements into an entirely new soundscape. It was as if he was arresting the context of what is familiar and switched it into an unfamiliar framework.
That's from a film by Jean-Luc Godard called The Chinois, the Chinese. It's late part of the 60s, in his Maoist period. Just want to get rid of this.
Montage is a process whereby the relationship between the image, space, and time becomes opened to the process of re-inscription and making strange. If direction is a look, montage is a heartbeat. To foresee is the characteristic of both, but what one seeks to foresee in space, the other seeks in time. Jean-Luc Godard. A single image from the image book, which consists of a dense intertextual weave of fragments into strange constellations. In this book, Godard proposes other ways of returning to a beginning, as if it might be possible to embark on a re-scripting of what is past. Jean-Luc Godard, The Image Book, 2018. Sorry, Jonathan, what was The Image Book?
It's a film he made, the late Godard film. It's like a kind of vast montage, kind of collage of images and text. So it works as a book. It's sort of like a book and a film.
I'm happy to keep reading, or if someone else wants to take over, I don't mind.
Does anyone else want to read?
All voices are better.
Go on then, Lester. We'll all listen to you for a bit.
Not
I
for
might
too
be putting
long.
people to sleep.
Yeah, not for too long though. Monogram was produced by Robert Rauschenberg between 1955 to 1959. It was, it was termed a combine as it existed between painting and sculpture, and rather than setting up a window-like view, it was closer to a tabletop type visual type address. He found the goat in a second-hand store and paid a deposit of $15 for it, which was unusual because he discovered most objects thrown away on the street.
When he went to pay for the final installment, the shop was closed. So it was originally agreed for, I think, $30, but he got it for 15, which was a lot of money for him in those days. He mainly had to work on pre-materials. Or on his pillow boxes.
Warhol reproduced a whole mass of Brillo boxes, 1964, for an exhibition. There was no aesthetic difference between the original and copy, so the attempt was to get as close as possible to the manufactured original box.
This is John Mayall, who died recently, at the age of 90. Sits on the left-hand side. But Eric Clapton is reading the Beano. It became known as Beano LP. But it was more or less a kind of version of English blues.
This recording became known as the Beano album, and it signified the emergence of a British-based blues culture. These recordings appropriated both older Delta and electric-based Chicago blues. In the later 60s, this mutated into what became known as heavy metal rock, which combined blues with psychedelia.
This is Cream, which features Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, and Jack Bruce. It is blues with psychedelia, as you can see by the graphics.
Sigmar Polk developed a relationship to the found image, which formed the basis of a strident and ironical critique of pop art that predates the advent of postmodernity. Sigmar Polk, Moderne Kunst, 1968. Levitation, 2003.
It's Levitation. This is Titian. Enunciation from 1559 to 1564. And that's a version he did of it. He did several versions based on postcards.
Gerhard Richter was moved by Titian's painting of the Annunciation and produced several versions of it based on a postcard copy. Each copy had a different level of registering the degree of abstraction.
This is Richard Prince and his rephotographing of Marlborough advertisements.
The artist Richard Prince started to rephotograph commercially sourced images and present them as his own art. In the 1980s, this was termed as appropriation art, art in the age of simulation, or more generally, new image art.
Cindy Sherman, film series, B-movie film series.
Cindy Sherman produced a series of works she termed film stills between 1977 to 1980. Each still reflects a female role within B movies as a way of exploring underlying imaginary situations.
It's Kathy Acker, the writer.
The writer Kathy Acker employed plagiarism as a method of throwing doubt into the whole question of both originality and identity.
There's Dickens' Great Expectations and Dunkirk's Song.
New urban street music arose in New York in the 1970s, which was based on sampling, scratching, and DJing. It became known as hip hop.
It's one of the most famous records of that period, Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, The Message.
Joel Peter Whitkin, Three Graces, Los Angeles, 1988.
Joel Peter Whitkin.
This photographic assemblage by Joel Peter Whitkin, The Raft of George W. Bush, took a month to construct after spending a long time looking at the original painting of Jericho. Whitkin did versions of many European paintings that introduced transgressive readings into the original.
It was a real event which created a scandal. The crew and the captain escaped on a small boat and left the 140 passengers to fend for themselves. And it resulted in cannibalism and a lot of deaths. Only about 15 people survived out of the original 140.
Viola, The Raft, 2004.
It's based on the idea of the raft, but it's a different construction.
Jeff Wall, A Sudden Gust of Wind After Hokusai, 1993.
It's Maruyama, Daido Maruyama, a rephotographing of a billboard in Tokyo.
Daido Moriyama created a hybrid relationship to the photographic image by mixing together street scenes with pop art and beat culture references. He would often photograph billboard images as if it might be possible to enter the imaginary realm of a commercially generated image.
It's also by Daido Maruyama. There's Jeff Koons.
Jeff Koons produced the work Poodle in 1991. The work resembles a typical kitsch mass-produced object except for the fact that it is expensively fabricated like a luxurious object that enables it to stand apart. There is a strategy of elevation at the center of this switching on the plane of value. Jonathan Miles' favorite artist, Damien Hirst, presented this tiger shark in formaldehyde in 1991, and it was immediately elevated into a national debate by virtue of mainstream press attention. As an object, it both fascinates and repels in equal measure, but it would be difficult to imagine any single object soliciting such a public response.
This is Anish Kapoor's Marsyas, which is in the Tate Turbine Hall. It was the biggest sculpture that had been assembled within a public space at that time. He took Titian's Playing of Marsyas, which was from 1570 onwards up to his death. It was in his studio at the time of his death. But it sets up a conversation, or it's meant to set up a conversation with Titian's original. I mean, in the process, it gets abjection and sublimity mixed up a bit.
Work's title, Marsyas, 2003, is based on Titian's painting The Flaying of, how do you pronounce it? Marsyas?
Marsyas.
Marcia, 1570 to 1576, which in turn was inspired by Ovid's literary work Metamorphosis. The installation evokes the flaying of flesh and with this the dissolution of boundary.
This is on the island where Apollo was meant to have been born. And it's Anthony Gorman did an installation for 29.
Jonathan Miles' second favorite artist, Anthony Gormley's installation of 29 sculptures on the sacred Greek island of Delos. There is an invitation to imagine his work in relationship to ancient Greek sculpture and architecture. Why this juxtaposition would give rise to a transformation of place and time is not really made apparent. Does this setting transform these contemporary works and suggest another possibility or lineages for these works? Or is it a case of exercise of exoticism? Site 2013.
This is the site with ancient sculptures which date from about the 7th, 8th century BC.
Whereas the stance of the postmodernist artists was invariably ironic in tone, the attitude to appropriation with Kapoor and Gormley is marked by a rhetoric of authenticity and even grandeur. All traditions or passage thus become opened out to the process of aesthetic reinscription. The question of art and its strategic relationship to appropriation is still important, even though at times it exhibits exhaustion much of the time. When the first found object was displayed, there was a sense of outrage to this gesture, but gradually the gesture became habitual to the point of no longer offering surprise. Alongside this response is the suspension of any sense of forward-looking posture within the aesthetic telos. Art now struggles in its own process of appropriating itself as art in any exceptional sense that was its promise post-Enlightenment.
It's a shorter presentation than usual, but a lot of range, a lot of scope.
So are we suggesting there at the end with Gormley and with Kapoor that they're sort of misusing that space in a way to sort of amplify or to step into something grander than their work may command?
Yes, it definitely is elevation of context. I mean, how we can see Gormley as part of a lineage of Greek sculpture beggars belief, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it's just a travesty.
And yet it seems important as an artist to present yourself in some sort of signifying chain in relation to what has gone on historically before. So, for example, Picasso's Meninas, linking himself to Velasquez.
But it's linked to also the Spanish situation and the history of the Spanish Civil War. So it's got a double purpose.
And he's moving the conversation on by his reinterpretation, really thinking about why he's reinterpreting, rather than stepping into a space that's sort of theoretically created because you're saying I am connected to this, whether they are or they aren't, in the case of Gormley.
I mean, it'd be like today they would restage Picasso in conjunction with the original, and it would be, I mean, a false relationship. I mean, it's not to do with the restaging of the original. It's got another purpose. I don't think it's so pretentious as to want to hang next to Velasquez. I don't think that's his point. The memory of Velasquez is already strong enough. I mean, it's the greatest painting of Spanish history.
I guess the appropriation art, by definition, relies on something that's in the cultural context and in the cultural memory, and it's reacting to that. So it relies on that social construct to be a work of art. You know, if you didn't know what a Brillo box was as a consumer, Andy Warhol's sculpture would hold no meaning.
But the memory becomes very shallow.
Oh, I completely agree. But I'm just saying it's something that without the cultural context, the work has no meaning or no grounding.
Mm.
I'm going to launch an attempt at a defense of Hirst and Kapoor and Gormley, in that what I find interesting is that shallowness. And when I think about Hirst and the artwork, as it were, or the kind of creation, I'm almost not thinking of Hirst. Hirst is almost like an actor who, given stage instructions by Lord Saatchi, who I really respect as an extraordinary kind of curator of the sort of 1980s Thatcherite and post-Thatcherite world, starting off in publishing, moving into this new sort of nexus between advertising, finance, and political campaigning, and then kind of constructed this extraordinary new shallowness of post-Thatcherite British art, and kind of marketed it, sold it, made it. And that's kind of an incredible thing for an individual to kind of do. And his brother Maurice did a similar thing for poetry and set up this incredible thing called the Forward Foundation, which has kind of shaped a way of verbal expression. And similarly, kind of, it's not quite as impressive, but Gormley's relationship, you know, they were friends at Cambridge, and I can't remember, you know, the guy, Sir Nicholas something, who was for many years the director of Tate Modern. They were sort of, exactly. They sort of, I mean, it was like a kind of duet of kind of handing these shallow coins to each other as they kind of moved up, and these coins, despite their shallowness, kind of became shinier and shinier. And they've kind of, you know, there's something, I don't really know so much about Kapoor, but I could easily see that work within that whole sort of post-1980s tradition of almost a total, like almost, I mean, I don't know, I have to admire it and think it's a thing of beauty, capitalization of of art, of sort of Emperor's New Clothes, of creating, whether it's using mainstream media as was described, or whether it's using these kind of spaces, or whether it's using this kind of new superpowered kind of banking sector of the 1980s and finance. And there's something about that whole tradition which is kind of amazing.
But Alex,
And
I would cut across and say I admire the S&P 500, and in fact I have a lot of investments in it, but I don't consider it art. And you brought up Saatchi, who I think is in a way is a genius, and I would bring the parallel back to Andy Warhol. And if you look at Andy Warhol and Saatchi, they both come up from a background of advertising, and turning the advertising and public taste and culture into elevating, a bunch of Brillo boxes as a work of art. I mean, how do you do that? Or Saatchi elevating the YBAs into a commodity, so you have a formaldehyde shark as a work of art. I mean, on one level it's genius, but I question, the art content of it. But then I guess I'm a bit old-fashioned in that respect.
The question is, I guess, how much did they move the cultural dialogue along? How much did they actually change us,
Yeah, but
other than just feathering their nest?
But is the measure of art how much it moves the cultural dial? Because then you could say, being provocative, 9/11 is, a great work of art.
which Hearst proposed.
Sorry, what's that, Jonathan?
Hearst actually proposed that,
Oh, did he? Oh, I didn't know that.
just as Gormley
great
proposed
minds.
the moon is a found object. I mean, the ultimate Gormley intervention is to put one of his sculptures on the moon to gaze at the Earth.
Well, I'm sure he's in discussions with Elon Musk as we speak.
Yeah. I mean, it also leads directly into the advent of 15 years of conservative ruination, rather than leads to an elevation of the cultural realm. It's a sort of disavowal and dissembling of it.
Well, it's saying the cultural elevation is you can elevate what you can measure by money. I think that's where I remember Yinka Shonibare saying something to the effect to his parents, who were fairly capitalistic, couldn't understand his going into art, but when he became successful and had a financially successful career, and getting his OBE or MBE, they could appreciate that. So, I think that's sort of the mindset of the conservative government that you're alluding to. If you can quantify it in pounds, then it's worthwhile, but if you can't, then it's a waste of time.
So I agree with Alex to a point that actually it was amazing what he did, and he became an arbiter of taste, Saatchi, by the way in which he bought things up and he promoted it and he sold it on and he did whatever he did. He created this incredible enthusiasm and a bubble around, his collection and his interest at the time.
It's genius, actually. Yeah, it's
He
amazing.
embarrassed the Tate Modern by collecting works which they didn't. The Tate had to secure purchases much later.
Probably sold by Saatchi himself before he dumped everything.
But I was talking to someone today, actually, who used to work at Sotheby's in the contemporary collections, and she just said, I can't tell you how much stuff he had, because his name came up, how much stuff is just in endless catalogues. Because I was saying, I was questioning what's happening to the art market now, and Saatchi's just given away apparently half his collection for the auction to the Ormond Street Hospital charitable trust, whatever. And she said, honestly, he's got so much. It's just endless catalogues full of all kinds of rubbish that he bought up along the way. So, but at some point he got lucky, or he drove the taste and the style down a certain way that he profited and benefited from. So well done him. The question is, who else was creating anything else or other that was in competition to that at the time? No one.
I mean, it's a symbol of the new capitalism of that period, where, I mean, he moved out of mainstream. I mean, he didn't stay in advertising. He moved across into art and made far more money in art than he would if it had maintained his interest in advertising. But eventually he got to the stage where he couldn't keep up any longer with the degree of capitalization. Whereas he had hundreds of millions, there was interests of purchasing like billions in terms of their portfolios. I mean, when he was buying, he purchased the shark for $25,000, which was the cost of bringing the shark over and putting it in formaldehyde. And it was sold for 10 million. And maybe it became worth in that period a lot more than after it was sold for 10 million. It was worth probably 20 million, but probably gone back to 10 million now. I don't know.
There's also something.
Yeah, go on.
I was going to say, kind of interesting about the way kind of identities. I mean, maybe I just don't know enough. Maybe this was always happening in terms of kind of curators and dealers, but there's something interesting about, let's say the makeup of the Conservative Party during the 1980s and early 1990s, and the makeup of the identities of people being kind of heralded within the YBA tradition. There's a sort of kind of something a bit uncomfortable about a kind of sort of a kind of an incorporation, but also a sort of almost a kind of feudal elevation of individuals from disempowered backgrounds, and there's something kind of quite sort of New Labour about that. I'm not necessarily thinking it's bad, but there's something kind of about art predicting the direction of what democracy was going to become.
You could argue the same happened in music as well, with those sort of puppet girl bands like the Spice Girls or boy bands. I mean, they were sort of a creation of somebody, weren't they? Where they were formed and created.
Thought she appropriate a role that he wasn't allowed, he shouldn't, or maybe wasn't a good fit to begin with. I don't know. Was he appropriating being a cultural guru of some sort, or a style setter? Maybe he just thought he'd wing it and see what happened, because he could recognize the sort of catch that these artists had. But he did a lot of damage as well by buying and dumping work. He changed his mind, and then sort of an artist can't really recover from that. So he didn't really know, he didn't have very good manners. He didn't really know.
In New York, there was a school of painting called pattern painting, and he purchased a lot of it. And after about 3 years, he didn't sort of perform in the market at all well. And he rang up the dealer who sold it to him and said, you either buy back at cost, my cost, or I dump it on the market and ruin you as a gallery. Make your mind up. I'll give you 24 hours. So he destroyed galleries as well as careers. I mean, it's sort of particularly ruthless.
I remember one artist on a gallery in Portobello Road, but I can't remember his name. And he sold out his show, and I believe it was to Saatchi. He then changed his mind the following week, and said it was a huge disaster for the artist personally. The gallery, it didn't affect the gallery that much, but it was, yeah, the artist found it really difficult to continue showing, sort of destroyed his upwards trajectory.
I mean, quite a number of galleries refused to deal with Saatchi.
Mm.
They saw it as kind of particularly dangerous.
Their galleries are very careful now, though, aren't they, about who they sell to? So maybe this is a
I mean,
lesson.
the Listen, for instance, has a undertaking that you don't sell on the works you buy from them. You don't put into auction. You don't flip them. So on the whole, they maintain their stance of being a non-flip gallery. But what would happen is that you get a gang of 6 collectors working together to elevate someone and decide either to hold or to flip. And they do it in a coordinated way. So they buy cheap, elevate the price, and then decide, is it time to hold? Is it going to go anywhere, or is it going to go down? And they flip or they hold. But it's sort of like insider trading. They get away with processes which, if it was in the financial sector, they'd finish up in jail.
This is precisely what's happening in Bitcoin and other what they call cryptocurrencies at the moment, but it's so unregulated that big institutions or individuals can sort of hold, and because it's kind of so heavily leveraged, because the amount is so scarce that a large dumping can completely crash prices, which you can then sort of I don't know. These things are kind of it's interesting. This is sort of kind of what you're just describing kind of predicts that there's something very kind of on the pulse, and not even on the pulse. I mean, this was sort of 20 years before, 30 years before.
I mean, Warhols are mainly owned by, there's 2 or 3 big owners of Warhols who've got massive holdings of Warhols, and they always move in on a sale in an auction to maintain a price or to elevate a price, or but they more or less single-handedly regulate the price of Warhols.
Like OPEC.
Yeah. And it's degrees of capitalism, the degrees of capital that are in the billions, not in the hundreds of millions. So it's outside the scope of most collectors. But you get a situation now where, I mean, a Gagosian can pick up an artist from the Royal College from 2 or 3 years previously and build up a kind of flash of recognition, put it in a big freeze, and sell for $500,000 2 or 3 years out of college. I mean, it's staggering. that elevation of artifice of prices.
So warn us of the dangers of that, Jonathan, when they come knocking. What are we going to say?
Well, I'm up for it.
Make hay while the sun shines and then get out of there.
But I have an acquaintance who works at Victoria Miro, and he was saying that because of the type of gallery they are, you know, they put up certain types of pricing, even for young artists, and that sometimes young artists struggle for that because then they can't necessarily maintain those prices afterwards because you can't drop the price because that devalues the work that Victoria Miro has sold. So he said sometimes it's actually a real negative for those young artists.
Maroon sort of artists, they can't move.
Mm.
They can't go forward and they can't go backwards.
So I would say, you know, it's not necessarily such a golden thing to be picked up by Gagosian and sell work for $500,000.
But is it because you exhaust the market for that, so there's not enough buyers for that particular artist or at that particular stage, rather than it sort of creating a sort of effect to the artist where they're sort of almost frozen by the fear of what they're going to make next?
Well, it's fast. It's to do with speed. You make it happen very, very quickly, and then you flip. So the drama is it going to be a case of flipping or is it a case of holding? And it depends on the way that museums move in on the game. I know this one sculptor who was working in Belgium, and he was selling moderately well, but he was basically broke. He was trying to work full time as an artist and couldn't do it. And he met a dealer in LA who said, "Come over, take a chance. I'll get you a studio, and we'll see what happens." And he got a studio in particularly dangerous part of LA, and within he set about producing a lot of work, and one day a limo turned up, or a group of limos turned up, and they bought half the studio. They hadn't even shown in LA, but they bought half the studio, and the next collector came along and said, "I'll have the other half." And just within one week, he was set up.
So how do you gain, or how do you get the attention? So that's the collectors. How about the institutions? How do you gain their attention? And is it important to be seen as part of this sort of signifying chain that you're linked to these canons and to prior artwork, to prior artists in the way that we've looked at with your presentation tonight?
Well, some galleries and some individuals, artists, play an institutional game, so they don't particularly look to the market to elevate them. They look to the museums and the major galleries to show them with prestigious writing, and it's a different strategy. So there's quite a number of artists whose reputation is just based on institutional. I mean, if you go to most museums, it's not necessarily coinciding with the market. The market goes elsewhere to the institutions. So the Tate Modern is quite politically correct, and the market is quite anarchistic and transgressive. It's not necessarily the same ethos. So a lot of it is what's written still, and what's word of mouth, and creating a kind of heat around someone's work, which doesn't necessarily fall into market. considerations, but institutional moves. So you've got these different apparatuses at work, and they don't necessarily get together and work it out together.
So would you be finding your way up through that institutional route by, I don't know, taking residencies at the South London Gallery, or how do you come to the attention of the institution?
Just network, just simply network. The right creators, the right critics, the right group shows come into being single shows. I mean, in the post-war American situation with abstract expressionism, they were selling for low thousands. So the cost of a Ford motor car or something for a big abstract expressionist painted by Pollock. But the boards of museums were invariably collectors. So the big collectors cornered the institutional market as well. So they were insiders. So they were often told what to buy. That there's tax reduction or tax. If you had a collection, you could take it against death duties if you handed it back to the Museum of Modern Art. The Museum of Modern Art would direct you towards what were the right things to buy. So collectors and dealers and institutions all work together. But that fragmented with figures like Saatchi, who disdained the institutional route. I knew this dealer, this is in the early 70s. He was friends with Sigmar Polke and a few of the other German names. So it was a time of capitalist realism. And he went to the Tate with Sigmar Polkes to offer them to buy at $3,000-4,000. And they refused. So these are just kind of German cowboys. So they refused to buy Richters and Polkes from him at incredibly low prices, historically the most lowest prices that were imaginable. So Tate missed it because they were too stuck in their own establishment. So invariably their collections were, they collected the wrong artists. Historically, they if you go back 30 years, what they were collecting, they didn't get the call right in most instances.
And so the board would have to approve the acquisitions for the gallery.
The acquisition. And
So if you've got the ear of the board member and they're buying your work, they're going to want the institution to buy your work to prop up their investment in their personal investment in you.
I mean, what often now collectors do is they sit on the board of something like the Tate, and they'll buy an artist and offer to sell give the Tate one of the paintings they've bought of an artist. So there's a lot of cronyism which they've become very suspicious of. It's got a lot tighter now, got a lot more guarded. But in the 80s, it was particularly marked, that kind of insider trading, as it were. And you've got to also realize that most art finishes up in cold storage. It's not available to be seen. It's not available. It's not in houses or institutions. It's in airports. It's like a virtual commodity to be moved around, tax-free. But they're massive, these warehouses.
There was an extraordinary documentary a couple of years ago. Was it on the Sotheby's or Christie's chain? and how those big collectors worked, and that they just park all of this work in these low-cost destination warehouses. You think, what a crime to have spent 60 million on something and they're parking it somewhere off the coast of China.
Can I add something onto this? I think I mentioned 2 weeks ago I was in Sydney. We went to a private collector's house, very impressive house with ocean view and everything. He did have his every wall filled with all those artwork. Plus, he's got a basement. One side is wine cellar, and the other side is his collection storage room, with one of those library sliding rack. Have a huge paintings, huge paintings. The philosophy of these people, he was a retired investment banker. He sits on Tate Gallery's international board, based in Sydney, Australian. And for these people is investment. So traditional investment would have, you would have quarter of your asset into, say, property, living, mortgage free, and another quarter in the property giving rental income. Another quarter is portfolio, share portfolio giving dividend income, and another quarter in art and collectibles. These do not give you passive income, disposable income like property or share portfolio. However, upside of that is the value, what you call, as over a period of time, say 7 to 10 years, most property should go value up, double. And artwork is the value doubling is much faster than the properties. You have to wait for 10. Some artwork you have to wait, so they just work with the curators and go, as Jonathan mentioned a bit earlier, pick up some emerging artists, young artists have trendy, and they collect about 3 to 5 years. They put it back to auction house and that sort of thing. So I just wanted to add, we've been talking about the commercialism and artwork become a commodity, but that's the truth, I think. Just wanted to share that.
I mean, art has joined the capital process. I mean, it's part of all portfolios now. So you buy gold, property. I mean, some people don't buy gold, some people buy property, some people buy stocks and shares. It depends on their expertise and where their careers align. So if you're in investment banking, you tend to pick up on stocks and shares which are based in the financial sector you're involved in. But they take advice from people who, I mean, it's all computerized, when to sell and when to buy. I mean, it's not no sort of just guesswork in this game any longer. And a lot of the funds, you don't actually own a painting. You own a percentage of a painting. It's like horses now. If you look at the St. Leger, there was sort of 4 or 5 owners. So the Coolmore gang are a sort of conglomerate of owners. There's not a single owner. So they have, they own Galileo and Breeder from Galileo, but they all take out a share in the original capitalization. So they might invest 100 million in a horse, but they each take out shares in the breeding of horses. And it's like a credible machine. It hardly puts a foot wrong. Each year they win, a quarter of the stage 1 horse races. So it's almost like a science. But they work in gangs or in corporate bodies or But it's a scale of capitalization which is kind of beyond your imagination.
Jonathan, in your writing about appropriation and in the presentation just now as well, you talked about the opening up of Rococo as a previously despised period into what could be a new lucrative market. And I was thinking about that at the beginning of this meeting when you were talking about the unusual or unexpected prevalence of drawings in the Van Gogh exhibition. And Sharon asked whether you felt that that kind of linked to previous discussions we'd had a few months ago about whether drawings are being turned to because they sort of seem to be, they seem to offer something that that sort of maybe appears more authentic or more kind of linked to the mind, or less sort of performative or gesturing towards an audience. But on the other hand, I was wondering whether you felt that, like Rococo, whether drawings could be a new frontier for this capitalization.
I mean, it's holds out a promise of being undervalued. It's always, I mean, it's never been, drawings are not shown in museum. I mean, because of the delicacy of them, they're often kept in dark rooms, and so they're overlooked. And so they've always played an important role in scholarship, but not in too much in terms of investment. But it's sort of it's not been exploited enough. So I think there's an intellectual interest, but it's also coincides with a turn of collectors towards less machine-like productions, more the authentic hand of the artist and more handcrafted, and so a lot of collectors are turning away from oversized, where you get almost factory-like production of artifacts. So drawings have a sort of authenticity or a kind of personality or and are more amenable to domestic. There's still, they're not massive artifacts which draw in a lot of capital as far as storage and maintenance and restoration.
But do you think that the sort of the drawing of that in a sense, kind of almost kind of closes that opportunity for contemporary artists, because the even if the lure is not followed, there is always the shadow of performing an authenticity, which is now popular.
There's certainly a turn if you just look at the number of shows in which drawings are being shown in museums and elevated galleries. It's a marked turn. There's a density of shows now. I mean, I think in the past they've never done a Van Gogh exhibition with so many drawings, if that wasn't a trend. There's a lot of public interest in drawings.
So there could be a couple of contributing factors, as Alex is talking about, where it's sort of like a moving away from the machinic and that sort of that virtual to the real. But is it also a possibility that the market's looking to scoop up anything that might be left from the masters? So if you've collected all the Francis Bacons and there's no paintings left, that there may still be a vast archive of drawings that are available on the market that have been undervalued.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I mean, it's really interesting, that show of like Frank Arbach, the attention that Arbach show got. I mean, it's seen as a really major exhibition in which it's, you know, like some people said, the drawings are better than the paintings, or more memorable than the paintings.
It's interesting because we always talk about what could the future be, or what is the contemporary, what time are we living in? And this seems to be one thing we keep returning to again and again, is this notion of drawing. It keeps coming up in so many of the discussions we're having.
I mean, I did a lot of, went to a lot of press views over the last 9 months, and there's a substantial number of them that featured drawing. And interesting in the level of literature about how you can write about them, because they often have cross relationships and appropriations and connections which not paintings don't always have. The drawings set up a kind of staging for larger works. And we've got to remember some of the great works of the modernism, like Picasso's Les Demoiselles, had a stupendous number of drawings attached to it. And you can only really understand Les Demoiselles through the looking at the drawings and the stages of transformation that the idea went through.
So is drawing more closely linked to writing in that way? Is that why they sit so closely? Is this notion of working something out on the page through writing, or working it out through drawing?
It's schematic. It's before something's in the world and named. It's to do with that very fragile moment of passage between something being unseen and unheard of to being seen and being heard. Sort of passing into recognition.
I think as a creator, for me personally, that's the most exciting moment.
Mm. I mean, drawing historically was always identified with academia, life drawing and drawing from antique copies, and so modernity was an escape from drawing in many ways, but it's like we've gone full circle now. We're returning to these drawings. Or returning to the idea of drawing as a process. I don't know, I think we're just sort of crossroads, or many crossroads. So I think that a lot of patterns which have been taken for granted are now in return.
there's a difference between mapping and drawing, though. So, would you say what UGLO does is mapping or drawing, and what is it that's important in the drawing? I use drawing as a process without just drawing using water as a movement. But so it maps, so it shows presence in the work rather than a mark.
Mm.
It doesn't create a product like something on a piece of paper, for instance. Like it's still a virtual. It's a virtual kind of drawing. But I don't know. I was wondering what you thought of Hugo's work as in terms of, and in his drawings.
Well, when I was at the Slade as a student, and he was running his live drawing classes, and it felt to me very robotic. All were using plumb lines and measuring devices, and kind of seemed to be a kind of artificial construct of what drawing is. But I appreciate it a lot more now, what the labor was, what the project was. It almost ended when he left the Slade. It disintegrated. So it was a very particular type of. I mean, people used to call it dots and dashes. Very schematic way of drawing, almost formulaic, but he had a particular sort of. I mean, I think he had this sort of turn towards color, which is really interesting, which was never there in the first place. There's a certain kind of quality which is quite obscure. It's not so obvious. It's not.
How does it? Oh, sorry. I was going to ask, how does it link to originality if his students are also doing the same kind of work?
A lot of them aren't original, are they? I mean, his originality is that he went against the grain of his own. I mean, he admired. He looked very carefully at, say, Piro and Poussin and Cézanne. So there's a particular way of understanding the tradition of art, a different lineage than most painters. Bacon looked at Velasquez, Manet, Picasso, late Rembrandt. So particularly related to late periods in pre-modernist art, pre-Baroque art. So his advocacy of Velasquez as a painter was against the grain of most modernists. He thought he was, what was that about? I mean, his Pope series was so exceptional that it kind of worked. But a lot of people who might have drawn upon Velasquez were seen as academic, whereas Bacon was seen as inspired. But that's become a kind of model, like a lot of painters now draw upon the Baroque. Cecily Brown, for instance, is more a Baroque painter, a late Baroque painter, late Rembrandt, late Titian, late even the use of de Kooning is a kind of recalibration of a tradition, of paintedness, of paint as a kind of almost substance that kind of carries force of history to it. So you've got a restaging of a painting tradition now, which is based upon a non-modernist appropriation or pattern of appropriation, which is non-modernist. Looking for another modernity, as if there's several modernities, that we were stuck with Greenberg for a long time, with the singularity of modernity. And as if that's completely blown apart now, we have different modernities. You don't have a pure modernity. And art historians come up with all interesting kind of ways of reinscribing modernity. They don't take modernity as a Museum of Modern Art in New York, that schema, which for a long time dominated the academic world. And that was built on a series of negations, very Hegelian model of modernity, all going towards the end of art. So after art's ended several times, after the death of paintings being performed, you've got to come up with something which is a different way of understanding temporality. So I think appropriation is like, I mean, it's interesting, even the British Museum, their defense of holding on to Elgin marbles is to do with an interpretation of world culture. So it's no longer just modernist European culture, but world culture. And so the identification of the collection in the British Museum has changed. I mean, whether or not it will work in the long run, I expect that at some point the marbles will return in one guise or another. But it's a very important anchor for British culture, this relationship to marbles. I mean, it's a fascinating story. It's a more or less the side of British imperialism is invested in its lineage to do with Greek appropriation. You go down to the City of London, and most of the historical buildings which establish capitalism, modern capitalism, have a Greek facade. And the despair of present day capitalism is that it no longer can draw upon that lineage. I mean, to enter Oxford or Cambridge, you used to have Greek and Latin, but certainly Latin. I mean, they stopped having Greek as an entry point, but you had to have Latin. Alex, did you learn Latin?
English is my second language, Jonathan.
What? English?
No, I was joking. I did learn Latin a long time ago, but John Stuart Mill, his father was a pathological utilitarian and brought up John Stuart Mill with Latin and Greek as his first two languages, and English as a third language. And by the age of 3, John Stuart Mill was being forced to do translations between Latin and Greek. And then he had a nervous breakdown. At the age of 13, he was being consulted by philosophers from around Europe because of his wisdom and knowledge. had a breakdown at the age of 18. Met an older woman when he was 25 who kind of mothered him in the way that he never had been, and he then wrote, I suppose, the foundational philosophical text in support of liberalism and democracy. So I did learn Latin and Greek, but not with the intensity of
Mill.
Mill.
But it's so slightly forgotten just how, particularly in the 19th century and early 20th century, that was fundamentally relationship to humanities and antiquities and languages.
Can I also add something into here? Thank you for sharing that, Alex. You know, I'm from Korea, but I was brought up with the Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism teaching. So now that I'm in my 60s, actually, I find myself going back to that sort of very Asian philosophy root. You mentioned about Latin and Greek and John Stuart Mill, which I learned through high school. But then we were doing Confucius and with the other one, Zhangzi, Laozi, all those things throughout our childhood and primary school. So later on, when I met some Chinese friends from, say, mainland China or Taiwanese, and I found that actually a lot more cases, I was a lot more knowledgeable and in depth on those very old Chinese philosophies. It's quite interesting. I just wanted to share how, you know, our upbringing from our childhood, from our surroundings, sort of inform us and shape us in our later life. I think it's just so interesting.
But one further thing, which I don't know whether this, I mean, as I understand it, the amazing thing about the Korean education system is that it's very, I mean, maybe too intense, but it has focus on lots of different subjects. But in the First World War, despite the myth of British heroism and an idea in Britain that Britain sort of single-handedly won, within battles between British and German troops, 1.7 British soldiers would die for every one German soldier. So almost 2 to 1 in terms of in terms of efficiency of soldiering. The German army and military was almost twice as effective when fighting British soldiers. And one theory for why this might be the case is that following sort of the unification and modernization of Germany in the late 19th century, particularly by Bismarck, the educational focus was on physics, maths, and engineering. And the German officer class were trained in physics and maths, whereas the British officer class were trained in Latin and Greek. And so, whereas someone like Wittgenstein, for example, who was very capable at directing trajectories of explosives and predicting where incoming explosives might land, the British soldiers were probably using tactics drawn from Thucydides. And I actually think that this kind of, this is turning into a bit of a rant, apologies, sort of almost like sort of rolls even into the 21st century. So you have Boris Johnson, who studied classics, Latin and Greek at Oxford, whereas you have someone like Angela Merkel, who was leading Germany at the same time, who had a PhD in some form of experimental physics. Yeah, I don't know what that says about the direction of British government and capability, but these traditions loom large and long.
They're memory systems, aren't they? They they make up a story of what civilization is, the syntax of it. So a memory system that right now is almost in ruination with the advent of internet and AI and kitsch. Okay, I think we're coming to winding up now. Any further thoughts? We've got onto a subject which is almost like a subject in itself, that we could, different way of looking at traditions and appropriation of traditions and memory systems and imagination of the yet to come. Any last thoughts?
Well, again, thank you for hosting, Jonathan.
Next week I've got a PowerPoint on Renaissance, which you could look at. Extraordinary revival of such a renewal of the antique tradition within Europe, the introduction of the concept of zero in the 14th century, which transformed banking. Banking in turn transformed the possibilities of aesthetic production, generated a level of wealth that had never been seen in Europe for centuries. Particularly focused on the relation between Northern Renaissance and Southern Renaissance, so Italian Renaissance and Germanic and Low Countries. So hopefully that will be of interest. We could do a trip in 2 weeks' time. On let's say a Thursday, we could do a West End walk around. So let's aim towards next week having a list of exhibitions we'd like to see. Walk about West End. There's an exhibition of paintings at Ropeck. We won't be able to see the Van Gogh because it's unrealistic to get a booking for, say, 15 or 12 people. So I think we could have a discussion after 6 weeks if you've managed to get to see it. It's worth seeing, but you have to book, and it's already quite crowded. It's on for 4 months. But it's showing paintings which have never been, a lot of paintings which have never been shown before. So its orientation is towards Van Gogh as a symbolist, really, rather than a post-impressionist. So it's a different take on Van Gogh, really. Has anyone got any exhibitions in mind they'd like to see? What's on at Gagosian? We'll work it out next. I'll check out, and if anyone wants to come up with a list, we'll do a walk around on, let's say, a Wednesday or a Thursday. Unless we've got to have a conversation. Do we do something on Zoom?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
I'll get in touch tomorrow and we'll make a time.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Any last thoughts? No.
No, it's been great. Can we do it again next week?
We'll look at we'll dig into the Renaissance.